I'd say, in the best sense of the word, that you are a storyteller, pure and simple, and that a lot of people who write novels and fiction are not storytellers. And do you start with story? Is that?
Well, you know, Isaac Fisher, the singer, that Nobel Prize winner, he loved to read suspense. And sometimes at the Mystery Writers Dinner, we would give a scroll to a famous person, Eleanor Roosevelt, for example, years and years ago. That was before my time. But I mean, I was well alive, but I mean, I wasn't a mystery writer. but someone who said they enjoyed suspense. And we gave him the scroll that year. And when he accepted it, that Nobel Prize winner said, "I do not care how eloquent your phrases, how polished your prose, unless you are a storyteller, you are not a writer." He said, "In medieval times, the storyteller went from castle to castle. He began with the magical words, 'Once upon a time,' and everyone went shh and drew closer to the fire. Begin your books with those words." And I think it's entirely true. A writer is or should be first a storyteller. Once upon a time.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's absolutely true about your books. And I think we've talked about that a lot in terms of how, when you're saying prose getting in the way, I mean, your prose has to serve your story. So
and it has to be the background. You have to be knowledgeable about the background, but your research shouldn't show. That you can sometimes see where somebody's research was so good that you're going to hear about it.
You're right.
Right.
I know it's hard to throw that research out sometimes, but you have to.
You have to. Well, I remember Michael Porter, my editor, all these years. Phyllis Gran of Penguin brought my book. She was a young author, and she was allowed $3,000 to buy a new author. And Harper and Rowe had turned me down in those days because
they saw
well, yes, they are. See, but the reason is when you read Where Are the Children, you know as an adult that the children who were dead had been molested. It is never on camera, ever. But they turned me down on the basis that children in that kind of jeopardy might upset their women readers. Somebody else returned it without comment. And Phyllis bought it for $3,000. And then she went over to Putnam, and that's when Michael took over. And there's something else in the title. I had called it Die a Little Death, because in that story, the mother had died a little death with her first two children when they were found drowned. She had blocked out what happened that day, gets out of prison on a technicality, a la Alice Crimmins years ago, remarries, and 7 years later to the day, on her 32nd birthday, the children of her second marriage disappear. And of course, she's the suspect. But I had called it Die a Little Death, because I had read Where a Mistress of Louis XIV. I had read her journal, and she had had a baby by him, and when it was 8 months old, it died. And she wrote in her journal, "And I, with my baby, died a little death." But Phyllis said, very, very smart of her, she said, "We want you to be a novel of suspense." That could be a Mickey Spillane title, Die a Little Death. We don't want you to be in just a thriller category. It's always a novel of suspense. And she came up with Where Are the Children?
So that book was, so editors turned it down because they thought it was too controversial?
Well,
Because of the idea.
that might upset their women readers. Because as an adult, you know what happened to those children. They had been molested. But, of course, that was nothing we wrote about nearly 40 years ago. But years later, I was at a dinner party, and the chairman of Harper, and whether it was Harper Collins, Harper Row, whatever it was at that point, he said, is there any way we could disenchant you with something and choose stuff? I said, what'd you turn me down for?
Oh, it's so, people live for those moments.
Very gratifying.
I was going to ask you this later, but Where Are the Children is based somewhat on a bit of a part of a true crime, yes?
Oh, what I have done with many and most of my books is taken a true crime and take the DNA out of it and reverse it. Because the first writing professor I had, I went to a very good girls' academy on a scholarship. My father had died, my brother had died in service. We were living on $78 a month. And I was frantic to make money. So I went to secretariat school. And I was a secretary for 3 years, which at Remington Rand, and they had their own in-house advertising agency. So at 18, I was secretary to the creative director. And I was sitting in on all of the discussions about why this ad worked, why this campaign did, why this slogan worked and this one did not. And so I had a 3-year tutorial in advertising, which served me extremely well because I was with, what is it, Mad Men? That was my time of being in advertising. I was widowed after 14 years of marriage and went to work, but I could go into an advertising department because I knew all about it. But that's a long answer to the fact that as soon as I got married, and I had just turned 22, and I'd been a Pan American hostess for a year and a half.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
Yeah, but I walked down from the honeymoon to NYU. I said, I have got to learn how to be a professional writer. It was yearning and churning, and I learned everything I needed to know in that class.
It was creative writing class?
A creative writing for short stories. I never dreamt that I could write a novel. But, and he was a little guy, and his tie touched his shoes. But he could teach a course. And he used to publish William Byron Mallory, his name was. And he published regularly in the magazines at that time. And he said, after a few sessions, assigned us to write a short story. And we all looked at Snake. He said, I see the look on your face. I said, you don't know what to write. Yeah, I know you don't know what to write. But I'm telling you what to write. Is there a family story, the family secret that you only hear about in whispers? Is something that happened in a friend's family? Is it something you read in the newspaper and you keep following that case? He said, you take that true case, you ask yourself 2 questions, suppose and what if, and turn that case into fiction.
So that's what you do with a lot of your secondary novels?
From the very beginning. In that case, I was doing a short story, and we had stowaways on some of the ships. And I wasn't with the stowaway, but I was also on the last ship, the last Pan American propeller plane that went into Prague before it was closed to American companies. We had no one in, we came in from Germany. We were picking up 7 Americans. There was an air show going on. The Soviets were showing their air power, in case anyone didn't know enough about it. And in the terminal was empty except for guards with machine guns. And there were several thousand people at the airport that were told to show up and employ. And I went in, and there were 7 Americans huddled together. And I went over to them, and they said, no one would dare see us off. It is not wise to advertise on American connections. And the captain came over, and he said, Mary, don't wander around. We're going to fuel up and get out of here. I don't like it here.
But you got a story out of it.
But I got a story. Because I thought, suppose the stewardess goes back first. Suppose there is a 17-year-old member of the underground trying to hide on a plane. And they're searching the field for her. And my 18-year-old brother had died in service 2 years before. So I could picture Joe with a shock of blonde hair. And I wrote that story, Stowaway. And when I turned it in, because I did suppose and what if. Suppose the stewardess goes back. Suppose there is someone trying to hide on the plane. Suppose. And when I turned it in, he said, Mary has written a professional short story. This story is going to sell. I guarantee that. And I called it Stowaway. Actually, I had a different title in the beginning, his suggestion, which I didn't care. I changed it to Stowaway. And I did sell it 40 submissions later. So that's why when people say to me, oh, I wrote a book, I sent it out once and it was refused, so I guess I'm not a writer. No, you're not a writer. I had 11 short stories in the mail by the time that first one sold.
And what happened with those, you mean that right after that one sold, you got
Then they
those
said,
out?
what else did you write?
Oh, okay.
So the same magazine, is mine off? Oh, sorry about that. Could you not hear me back there?
How are you doing back there? Yes, you can hear us? Oh, okay, okay.
Okay, that's good.
All right.
And then I started selling to Good House, Women's Day. I sold the one I told you about to the Saturday Evening Post, and it was one of the 10 best stories of the Post in 1961, which is an awfully long time ago.
I have a question for you. I'm sorry to interrupt you. There was the suppose and the what if, but you said you got all you needed about writing out of that class, and I'm curious what those other things were that teacher passed on to you that you would think, were really the important building blocks for writing, at least for you.
Well, first of all, I added one more question, why? Because if you're going to write suspense, somebody, 4 people might have done it, had every reason to do it, had the motivation and the opportunity. Only one of them went over the line. So you have to know the why of the story before you start to write, this one did it, and why. Here are the characters, this is a situation. And then, of course, it's when the story, after you rewrite the first 52 pages, then when the characters take over and do their own thing, then that's when writing is fun. That's when you chase them down the block, as opposed to trying to drag them down the block.
So does that mean you don't necessarily outline but you have an idea and you follow it when you write?
Yeah. Well, for example, in Children, it was the young mother had been accused and found guilty of murdering her 2 children. Both convictions were overturned on technicalities. She married a rich boyfriend, has been living high on the hog these past almost 40 years. She goes by the name of Alicia. She was Alice Crimmins. And one time when I was lecturing in Largo Key, who do you think was there on her yacht, the Alicia? But Alice, I did not run into her.
Oh, she didn't come to hear you.
I don't think she would have been. But I just reversed it. Suppose an innocent young mother is found guilty. So I don't take the true case, I reverse it.
And you find something like a kernel of it that is inspiring.
The DNA of it. The one about a guy who had a heart transplant, went to thank the young widow of the guy who had been the donor, and he had shot himself. He was chronically depressed. This guy ended up divorcing his wife, marrying the young widow, and a few years later shooting himself. And the reason, in the same way, and the reason that some doctors give out is that the heart has molecules, and you will take over some of the personality of the person whose heart you get. And there are 70 examples of people. A guy woke up and all he wanted was a beer. He never drank a beer in his life. Somebody else who got the heart of a 16-year-old said to his wife, bring me in a chocolate bar. He was not a candy eater. And somebody else who had never liked classical music, only liked rock, suddenly wanted to hear classical music. So I thought, I just took the kernel of that, and I thought, suppose someone receives a young prosecutor, and she's trying a case against a big theatrical agent who was accused of murdering his actress wife, and she didn't know that she had the actress's heart. So while she's convicting him, something is saying to her, he didn't do it. He didn't do it. And I call that just take my heart. But I thought it was a good story because I thought it was a good premise.
I'm just trying to think if one did have the heart transplant, you'd have someone to blame. But,
Well, I asked a guy who had a heart transplant, and I said, have you changed? He said, well, of course, when you come to death's door, you're going to, in some way, be different when you know that you're probably not going to make it. But he said, on the other hand, I was always considered arrogant and overbearing by my employees, by my wife, by a lot of people. And he said, I must have received the heart of a much nicer person now. Because he said, I'm much more tolerant now, more understanding of the other guy's viewpoint. So he said, I don't know whose heart I have, but I think he must have been an awfully nice guy. There you go.
Yeah. You had mentioned before about being widowed at an early age, and I know that people have read this about you. You had 5 young children, and you had, at that point, had you only written stories, or had you written the not crime fiction book?
No, it was always short stories. Warren died in '64. In '63, I had made $7,000, which by the terms of then was not bad at all. It was nice extra money. In 1964, Warren died in September. We knew he had a bad heart. Fortunately, he lived for 5 years with a bad heart. But I had made $50. And he was joking that he was supporting an indigent writer. So no, then I went back to, I had been asked to write radio shows, 4-minute programs. And I had subbed for a friend who did it, and she said, you know, they want you to take your own show. 5 scripts a week, 13-week cycles, $20 a script, $100 a week. And I had said, Liz, I can't do that with 5 kids. I'm writing short stories. And the children were doing modeling. I was always trying to save an extra buck against what I knew was coming. But the morning that he died, I called her and I said, Liz, Warren just got back from the hospital. He'll never go back to work, and I don't think he has more than 6 hours, more than 6 months. And she said, well, there is a show called Portrait of a Patriot. I said, well, if they'll have me, I'll take it. Well, he died that night. And 10 hours later, so the next week I went in and I picked up the material and I wrote Portrait of a Patriot. Then I took on a 2nd show, then a 3rd show, and then I went in and worked in the office.
And how long did you do that, the radio?
I did it until I sold A Stranger Is Watching in 1977.
So you were doing the radio shows
from 64 to 77.
And you were writing your novel at the same time and raising your 5 children.
Yeah,
right.
But, you know, but the thing is that people get up at 5 in the morning to jog. I got up at 5 in the morning and I worked until about 6:45. The typewriter was on the kitchen and it was on the floor and I put it on the table. And the first book that I tried, because I was writing Portrait of a Patriot, and the one guy I had skipped was George Washington. You know, I cannot tell a lie. I did not chop down the cherry, or I did chop it down. I thought, what a colossal bore. But then they said, you really can't ignore the first president. So I started to do research on him. And I thought, we don't know this man. I can't believe what I'm reading. He was 6'4", when men were 5'7". I had read he married an older woman for her money and was very much in love with someone else. Yes, at 16 he had a big crush on 18-year-old Sally Carey Fairfax, his best friend's wife. She taught him how to dance. They were his best friends. Sure, he had a crush on her. but she was happily married, and there was no touchy-feely going on there whatsoever. And then when he met Martha, he was a colonel in the reserves. He was the hero of Monongahela because the French and Indian War, because he warned the British general that he could tell the signs that the Indians were gathering. He could see them. And they marched, they crossed the river and were in complete disformation, the redcoats, with their noise of coming, and they were massacred. He was the one who got the general, who was mortally wounded. He regrouped the troops. And the general, I think his name was Gates, I forget it at the moment, but he bequeathed him his manservant and his horse. So at 26, he went back to Virginia as the hero of the French and Indian War. And he met Martha. She was then married to a husband who adored her, who was 21 years older and had been her godfather. Everyone called her Patsy. Her father said Martha is much too powerful a name for such a tiny little girl. The next time he met her, she was a widow. And yes, she was older. She was 27 to his 26. And it was the happiest of marriages. She went through the British lines to join him in Boston. And Cokie Roberts, in her book, The American Founding Mothers, she even has a line there from Abigail Adams, who talks about the deep affection between the general and his wife. She was with George in Valley Forge that whole winter. And I thought, why don't we know this? He called her my dearest Patsy. He wore a locket with a picture all of his life. And when he was chosen to be head of the Revolutionary Forces, his letter to her was, because he had to go straight to Boston, I would rather spend 1 month in your company than a lifetime elsewhere. So I thought, there's a love story here. And I spent 3 years writing it. And it was bought. I used a dumb title, Aspire to the Heavens. It was his mother's family motto. And the few bookstores it went into, it was next to the Bible in the spiritual section. But that was when I said, well, I got nice reviews, nobody bought it, but at least I can write a book and get it published. I got $1,500 for that book. But then
so that came out of the radio work.
Yeah, 1969 it was published.
And A Stranger is Watching, which
was after children.
Right. Which is all about guilt and innocence and
sure, and danger.
Can we go back though for a second? So I'm curious to hear your process. So you got up at 5 in the morning and you wrote for 2 hours.
Till 6:45.
Until the children got up.
Fed them.
And then,
and caught the carpool to work.
And got home, and you didn't write at night then, you were dealing with the kids.
It was dinner, and it was the usual, put the wash in, and it was the homework, and it was what everybody else.
And how long did it take you to write that book that you were writing in the morning?
It took 3 years.
Uh-huh.
It took from 1964 or 65 till 69, and it was published. And then when I realized that, I said, I know I can write a book, and I got nice reviews, and I looked at my bookshelves, which is what I say to people who want to write and say, I don't know what to write. I said, look at your bookshelves, what do you like to read? Oh, I just love books. I just love all kinds of books. I love biographies, I love histories, I love this. I say, okay, we're all eclectic. What do you pick up at the end of the day? What do you grab when you go on a plane? What do you want when you know the roof is leaking or one of the kids hasn't been invited to the prom? So you get your cup of cocoa or your glass of wine and you curl up. And I realized that my shelves were loaded with fiction, with suspense, starting with Judy Bolton and Carolyn Keene, and then Josephine Tay and Ira Marsh and Mary Roberts Reinhardt, and just on we went. And I realized I had been teaching myself from the time I was a child how to write those, because I wanted to be the smartest reader, the one who picks up. That doesn't mean anything, but this does. And why those books I kept to the end, and others I struggled because I had paid for them or gotten them out of the library to read the rest of them. So when I went to write Where Are the Children, I was trained in suspense writing, not knowing it.
And you knew that's what you wanted to write.
The minute I started to write it, I knew this is where I belong.